because this is also the crunch period for negotiations as well, I feel. And always in negotiations, climate finance remains the crux of the matter to a large extent. How do we access the finance? What is the basis of the finance? And ultimately, how can we, actually make whatever pledge we've made here, whatever we've discussed here, actionable? So with this, we are really, really appreciative of the work that we are doing with UNDP, of the support that UNDP is giving to us to crack this nut of climate finance. Earlier this week, I heard from the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Vanuatu, who very emphatically said that climate change is actually a human rights issue, for the very practical reason that for vulnerable countries, climate change is forcing us to divert valuable resources, valuable financial resources, away from building schools, building hospitals, building infrastructure, and instead trying to tackle the impacts of climate change and trying to essentially just survive. So on this basis, it just means that if we do not have any financial support for the action on climate change, we are essentially just shooting ourselves in the foot and basically setting ourselves up for not succeeding at the SDGs. And why is climate finance in particular so important? Is because it has a cross-cutting impact on other SDGs as well. So essentially investing in climate action on the African continent will actually help us achieve our goals, other SDGs as well. And we've heard so many times that Africa needs adaptation finance. And I think what the value of the reports that we have, that we are going to be presented with, is that when 10 years back, a decade back, we were told that we need to mobilize 100 billion per year by 2020 to support climate action in developing countries. This baseline has changed now. The cost of action is much higher, and we are dealing with a different context. And I know that we are hearing that there's a cost of living crisis, that we need to take into consideration changing realities, but the truth is we are going to be living in an increasingly complex world where these layers of complexity and challenges are going to keep happening. So having accurate mapping, and as well as an analysis of entry points for vulnerable countries is so important, because the game has changed, the baseline has changed, and we need new data, we need new commitment. And for us to be able to target that commitment, we need to be able to know where we're going from. So with this, I really welcome this session and the work that we're doing, and I really look forward to engaging more with whatever we are going to be learning from these different studies and utilizing them to target interventions where they're most needed. Thank you very much, Daisy.
Thank you very much, Madam Baka, for those opening remarks. Here at COP27, the key reports that have been discussed regarding climate finance. One, the report on the 100 billion per year that by 2020, that Madam Baka was referring to. And of course, the answer is clear, we have not achieved that. Then the new collective quantitative goal on climate finance. Then of course, what's quite the hype here is on loss and damage financing facility. That's a very important one, and we've had heated debate on that particular one. And of course, our work, particularly on the adaptation expenditure, feeds it into, again, the global goal on adaptation and the global stock take. So I just wanted to highlight that what we are doing is very important, and it will feed into key COP processes. And of course, I think one report, two reports that I forgot to mention now, of course, from the financial mechanism of the convention, the Green Climate Fund and the GEF, these reports have also been discussed. So having said that and having thanked Madam Barker, let me give the floor to Alta to give a very, it will be very short, I hope, Alta, as you can see. We have had lots of sticky points with the negotiations. So people are going to go right into the night, and I'm sure we are going to extend. So people are very, very busy here because of that lack of consensus on lots of texts. So if you can just be very brief on your presentation of a very important report. By the way, many colleagues are expressing their interest in this report since it has never been done before at Africa level, Africa public expenditure on adaptation. I think it will really add value to the finance track that I was talking about, where we have all these other reports. So over to you, the floor is yours, Alta. And if you can introduce yourself just briefly so that people get to know who you are. Thank you. Over to you.
Thanks. I'm Alta Fulcher, and I'm one of a team of 5 who have undertaken the study. I'm a public financial management and public finance expert, whereas other members of the team, like Kit Nicholson and Stephen Mutimba, brought the climate change side of the study. I have with me online also Shanaz Brewerman, who worked also on the public expenditure side of the study, and then another member of the team is Yassine Diachale, who did 2 of the country case study. So you can go to the next slide. Thank you, Shanaz. So the study is a Pan-African review of publicly available evidence on adaptation needs and adaptation expenditure. It uses publicly available data to provide across Africa and country estimates of the gap between adaptation needs and current domestic public and private adaptation expenditure, as well as sector and country gaps. We have covered 51 out of the 54 African countries. As interesting as the estimates are, in the end, the study was an effort to demonstrate the use of a spreadsheet-based analytical framework that uses the essence of accepted global modeling on climate change needs while retaining full transparency on the analysis undertaken. The objectives, as you can see on the slide, is to illustrate this practical method, to catalyze country-level engagement with the modeling of adaptation needs, and also catalyze country exploration of evidence-based strategies to close the gap, to draw lessons on improving MRV of adaptation expenditure, to emphasize the importance of evidence on the effectiveness of public expenditure and private expenditure on climate adaptation, and then finally, indeed, to contribute to the debate on the adequacy of adaptation financing in Africa. The study is therefore very much complementary to other global and African work, including some of the studies that you have just mentioned, Daisy. Please go to the next slide. So this slide captures in one slide our methodology. On the one hand, in step 1, it estimated the financing needs by estimating the projected climate change damage and expressing this as a net present value of the reduction in GDP because of climate change up to 2050. And then estimated what expenditure would be needed to reduce this loss, given assumptions about the effectiveness of public expenditure and private expenditure in different sectors to reduce the potential loss and damage. These are the left-hand components of the diagram. On the right-hand side, on the top of the diagram, is the other leg of the study. And this is the estimation of public adaptation spending through the national budget and ODA climate funds and broad estimation of private adaptation expenditure for the 51 countries that we covered. These estimates are from public data sources and is weighted similarly using evidence from studies. The gap is then obviously calculated by deducting the current expenditure from the estimated expenditure needs, and this is expressed as a share of GDP. The final leg of our report is to apply this framework then to demonstrate how country adaptation strategies can use the framework and the evidence from the framework applied at the country level to reduce the gap. Next slide, please. So starting on the top left-hand side of the slide you just saw, so in order to estimate the maximum potential loss and damage for each country, we developed a country index of exposure to each of 5 climate risks, and these risks are presented on the graph. The exposure indices are derived from an average of 16 different international indices across all risks, which we weighted according to their perceived status. The chart shows that most countries are indeed exposed to significant climate risks from heat, rainfall variability, and drought. And these are the orange, yellow, and green bars on the graph on the chart. Exposure to flood risks, the dark blue bars, and sea level rise. The top right blue bars is more varied for obvious reasons. Next slide, please. The potential loss and damage is then the economic impact that would occur with no adaptation. GDP sectors are affected differently by the different climate change dimensions, by the different risks, and the aggregate GDP impact in each country would be the sum of the impact on each sector. So the study then estimated the total potential loss and damage in Africa by using 11 impact pathways and calculating how they will affect in each country 8 GDP sectors. And the next couple slides over will show how this worked and what the results are. The study estimated the direct loss of sectoral GDP based on the exposure indices and then applied these to countries' GDP sector shares using African Development Bank national accounts data, the estimate of country sensitivity to climate change. This estimate was then dominated by the sectoral composition of countries' economic activity and the scale of the vulnerable infrastructure. As Madame Barker referred to, this is a significant driver of loss of GDP, the investment in repairing this infrastructure that would have otherwise gone to development. The impact on the components of GDP comes through, firstly, loss of productivity, and then the need to devote additional resources to prevent more loss in future. The maximum impact on sectors, in other words, without any adaptation expenditure, includes both the immediate loss and damage from specific climate events and the longer-term effects from climate change, calculated in a cumulative way over time until 2050. The study estimated damage based firstly on reduced labor productivity, so 3 main factors went into each pathway, and this affected the primary, secondary, and tertiary sectors. And then a second major impact is through the value of assets and how repairing this value after climate events or due to the chronic effect of climate change would divert investment from development. Next slide, please. So this slide is a Sankey diagram which then illustrates the GDP impact, the potential loss and damage for Africa from the 5 climate risks through the 11 pathways. It shows, for example, that heat stress, if we take the orange one at the bottom, will contribute 2.067% of the total net present value of potential loss and damage, by 2050. And this would be mainly through impacts on health and labor productivity, affecting services, the services sector most significantly. It's good to note that this diagram would obviously be very different for each country, and our three country case studies illustrate that. Countries with large agriculture sectors and smaller service sectors, for example, would be more sensitive to loss and damage through rain variability and drought, and perhaps less sensitive to the impacts of heat stress. Next slide, please. So having estimated what the total potential loss of damage would be, so in aggregate for Africa, 4.5% of GDP in net present value, current value, through to 2050. We then needed to estimate what volume of public expenditure will be needed to reduce that damage. And this we did by dividing the potential loss and damage by estimates of the effectiveness of expenditures, apologies, in reducing this loss and damage. Next slide, please. So the effectiveness of different sector expenditures we estimated by applying standard adaptation benefit cost ratios derived from existing studies. So the adaptation benefit cost ratios recognize indeed that most adaptation expenditure delivers a mix of development and adaptation benefits, and that this mix will differ between sectors. As shown in the graph, the benefit, for example, of every 1 unit of expenditure in agriculture is higher than the benefit from any 1 unit in health. We applied these sector-specific adaptation benefit cost ratios then consistently to the different countries' potential loss and damage readings. The evidence for these weights came from 3 global reviews by the African Development Bank and the Global Center on Adaptation, and grey literature and climate change impact appraisal case studies. Of course, the exact ABCRs, we have to emphasize, would also vary by country, depending on the challenges facing the country and also on the efficiency of government expenditure in different sectors to affect adaptation. It's worth also noting that this is probably the weakest link in the study, but one can safely assume that the values would be somewhere between 2% and 5%. Next slide, please. This slide then just quickly presents the estimates of adaptation expenditure needs or the potential loss and damage divided by the potential effectiveness of expenditure in each country. And the result, the bar on the further right-hand side, is that 7.8% of GDP value of expenditure is needed to reduce the potential loss and damage. Next slide, please. So the next step then is to estimate existing adaptation spending. And we looked at 3 components. The first was the national budget. The second was ODA expenditure, so climate finance ODA, official development assistance, and private expenditure. And I'll briefly go through each. Next slide, please. So existing adaptation spending, the analysis of current public spending on adaptation is based on the documents that are publicly available on the websites of finance ministries on their appropriated or budgeted public expenditure. The analysis used the latest budget approved before the start of COVID. And just to note, where there was boost data available that's already in very accessible formats for countries, we used the boost data. The study coded then the expenditure data into 21 adaptation relevant subsector categories using the most granular level of allocations available. down to a project or unit level of expenditure allocation. For most countries, the expenditure was limited to central government because that's the only data that's available publicly. For all countries, of course, this would then include transfers from the central budgets to subnational units of government as well as to public enterprises. For 3 countries, because of transparency in these countries, we were then also able to get own revenue expenditure by subnational governments, agencies, and public enterprises. And that was in Seychelles, South Africa, and Egypt. And these are included in the estimates for these 3 countries. International funding was included as reported on budget. We then weighted this classified data with objective-based weights, standardized ones for each category of the 21 categories. We used objective-based weights rather than benefits-based weights to align with the most common methodology used in African CPEIRs and emerging CBT systems. And they are akin to the Rio marker weights used to tag climate expenditure in ODA in the OECD DAC methodology. The weights we used are derived from existing CPEIR results. It's worth noting that the study focused on preventative adaptation, which reduces loss and damage, not reactive, which accepts that there will be loss and damage and then responds. For example, humanitarian or reconstruction, social protection, etc. spending. Overall, for Africa, the weighted public expenditure on adaptation was just below 1% of GDP. The second component is then ODA, and for that we use the OECD DAC climate tagged expenditure. On this slide, and it's very small, apologies, but the little horizontal bars just demonstrate where country public budget adaptation expenditure was at, and then bottom colored bars is the distribution of OECD DAC climate expenditure estimates. The expenditure from ODA is mostly lower because, of course, national budgets include spending funded from domestic revenue. There is in the study, good to note, an overlap between national budgets, ODA spending, so on-budget donor spending. In order to net out the overlap will require detailed country-level work. But if anything, it means that the gap is underestimated rather than overestimated, so it does not affect the implications of the study for the size of the gap and the data that's needed. The graph shows that some, but not all countries with significant ODA spending are depending on this spending, as domestically financed expenditure is low. Examples here, and you wouldn't be able to see it because it's so small, but it's Djibouti, for example, Somalia, and South Sudan. Next slide, please. So very briefly on private sector adaptation expenditure, the data here is very limited still, despite the growing interest in improving the coverage and consistency of reporting, for example, like the Green Taxonomy process or initiative in South Africa. The study estimated, though, private expenditure by estimating private investment in climate-sensitive sectors and then applying the same adaptation benefit cost ratios as for public expenditure. Private investment was estimated as private gross fixed capital formation with estimates of sector shares using cross-Africa and country GDP share data. Next slide, please. So this brings us to the gap as a share of GDP. Note that the reddish and pink bars on the graph have 2 components, and these components of the bars is the gap. And there's both a coverable and an uncoverable gap. This distinction assumes that there are some needs that are uncoverable In other words, that some needs are from potential loss and damage that is not worth avoiding because there are no cost-effective options, adaptation options available to avoid that last bit of potential loss and damage. And this is approximately a quarter of the total potential loss and damage. The coverable gap then represents the expenditure on the share of potential loss and damage that can still be reduced through adaptation expenditure. And this is then where the NDC financing frameworks should focus. The combined gap is 66% of GDP for Africa as a whole. Next slide, please. So this map then presents the country gaps as a share of expenditure needs. And it illustrates well the size of the gap. So the darker red a country is, the bigger the gap is as a share of total needs. So including both the coverable and uncoverable gap. Next slide, please. Because the data is sector-based, we were then able to also look at alignment. The study was between sector needs and sector expenditure. And this slide shows the extent then to which sector shares in country adaptation spending match the sector shares in country loss and damage. There were challenges across, if you take the cross-Africa data, in some sectors that are significantly underfunded, agriculture, crops and irrigation. It also showed up some challenges in the study methodology for how the water sector needs are calculated. Next slide, please. I'm not going to dwell here briefly because my time is running out, but just to say that we had country case studies, 3 of them, and they confirmed that this methodology can be applied at a country level to provide as an analytical framework to build some consistency in country work for estimating gaps. Next slide, please. So finally, on the bottom right-hand side of our methodology, some illustration of how this framework can be applied to structure adaptation strategies. Next slide, please. So the table here is assuming that this is a hypothetical country and using average values from the study. Initially, in the hypothetical country, only 20% of the adaptation needs was covered. Using evidence-based potential figures for closing the gap, the typical scenario is then that after 10 years, 50% of the needs will still be uncovered, and 27% can be covered, and 23% will remain uncoverable and need to be covered by reactive adaptation spending. So I won't go into too much detail, but just to quickly run through. So if countries grow, a further 6% could be added from expanded revenue as a share of GDP. 2% could come from a 10% gain through more effective public expenditure on adaptation through mainstreaming into planning and budgeting frameworks. 7.4% can come if the 100 billion target is achieved, with the additional 3.5% linked to the new collective quantified goal process. Innovative financing instruments such as green bonds could expand the fiscal space further for countries, potentially adding 1%. In the second block, private sector growth would naturally grow from a base of 5% by an additional 5% as the private sector becomes more aware of the impact of climate change on their profitability and naturally choose to have more climate sensitive infrastructure, etc. investments. But a further 5% can be accelerated if government policies establishes some incentives or promote public-private collaborative adaptation investments. So the table suggests that growth, mainstreaming, additional external financing and innovative instruments, as well as private sector improved effectiveness of expenditure, This would still leave a remaining gap of 27% of GDP to be covered. This uncovered gap could be closed by year 15 on our calculations for faster growing countries, and also because in these countries, the sector composition of GDP would change to industry and services, which have a lower potential loss and damage. But in this period, international finance would remain critical. So briefly, apologies, I'm 2 minutes over, I know. Looking at our conclusions, the study shows that only 15% of adaptation expenditure needs are met in Africa, taking into account public and private spending. It shows also the potential role of domestic adaptation funding in the long term as more African countries attain middle income status. But the remaining gap is significant. It is equal to about 150 billion annually in USD, and this will just grow with GDP growth. Secondly, the study shows the importance of preparing and using country-specific strategies to close the country gaps, and how it could blend elements of different kinds of financing. It shows the critical role of integration of climate change into country planning and budgeting frameworks, and undertaking also climate change impact assessment to provide better country-specific evidence on how effective public expenditure is in reducing loss and damage. Next slide, please. There are also some implications from the technical challenges that the study face for the knowledge base on adaptation needs and spending in Africa. Just to mention briefly, better data is needed on the impact of climate events in Africa to improve the coverage and indices. National determined contributions should reflect potential loss and damage better, for example, by a wider coverage of impacts and using a single metric to guide trade-offs within strategies. To re-emphasize the point from the previous slides, we need better evidence on the effectiveness or benefit-cost ratios in Africa. And finally, there's a lack of transparency on subnational expenditure and expenditure off budget, which would need to be addressed for this kind of work to take place. And finally, there's a need to tighten and improve how climate change expenditure is estimated to encourage trust in and the usability of estimates. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alta. I think let me give the floor to colleagues online if they want to add anything. Let me first of all give the floor to them. Shanaz, Stephen, if you want to add something. Thank you.
This is Stephen. Thank you, Alta, for that presentation. I think you captured everything. It's well presented. I really don't have anything to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Shanaz.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, Alta. I think you nicely summarized this work. I mean, I think I just want to highlight the fact that, you know, despite significant progress that's been made by governments, you know, in financing climate adaptation, as Alta's shown, the gap is still large. And, you know, even under the most optimistic, you know, scenario, you know, this gap will remain, and therefore, you know, we really are calling for the international community, you know, to as well to come in and provide assistance, given the devastating impact climate change is already having on the most vulnerable people, you know, in Africa. So, just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shanaz. And maybe Alta, if I were to ask a very simple question, maybe from a negotiator's perspective, how can they use the findings of this report from a negotiator's perspective? That's one. And also from government perspective, how can they use this kind of report in the sense of the discourse at the COP? Like I was telling you, the reports that we are discussing, the issues that we are discussing on loss and damage, on the global goal on adaptation, on the new goal on climate finance, how does this fit in? I think in simple language, they would like to hear from you. Thank you.
Picks up on what Shanaz just said. Um, Firstly, is that African governments are already spending on adaptation. And given that spending is often up against the fiscal limits for countries, and barring some improvements in the effectiveness of the spending for adaptation, um, uh, uh, um, they are already spending as much as they can. But yet, the gap is very large. And it's worthwhile emphasizing, of course, that these are the economic impacts of climate change. There is also quality of life, etc., impacts on the populations. Um, Secondly, is the importance of not diverting country resources from development to address the loss and damage of climate change. It is picking up on the point that Madame Barker made at the start of the session, that the impact will be the potential loss and damage to GDP will be significant, assets will be affected, and it will divert resources from where it otherwise would have been spent, in other words, on development and GDP growth, and jobs and improvements in the quality of life.
Thank you. Let me check if people here, if anyone has a question. Madam Bak.
No, it was very comprehensive.
Thank you very much. I guess it's getting towards the end of the day. Thank you so much, Alta, for your presentation. And thank you, colleagues, all the colleagues who are online for joining this event. And as we proceed, like we said, we hope this can feed into the Standing Committee of Finance processes, and even at Africa level, we hope that this very useful report, which reveals important figures like the gap figure that we were talking about, only 15%, we hope that the AG and the Africa Group of Negotiators will find this report useful and, of course, use it to negotiate whether it's the new goal on climate finance or whether it's the loss and damage financing facility. I guess we can then have solid evidence that we can use to argue our case. So from us here, thank you so much, and we hope next year we proceed with the next steps of this very important report. Thank you so much, and maybe let me just say goodbye to everyone from Sharm el Sheikh. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you. Bye-bye.
And thank you.
Bye. Unfortunately, I had just started taking new notes and going, which that's an interesting point. And we just thought that because I can imagine. Next time, no. Not at the end of the day or the last. No.
That I will agree with.